I'm going to discuss the motion on the university admission standards. Specifically, the motion reads, this House prefers university admission standards in Singapore to be based solely on a single high-stakes standardised exam as opposed to solely on the average of the pupils' performance over the course of their studies. As a preface, I think this is a motion that requires a clear model coming from both sides. I think in essence, most students should be able to identify that the debate concerns a model of, say, a public exam like the GCA A-levels as the model for the high-stakes standardized exam. And the opposing model or the contrasting model would likely be that of, say, a GPA system that you would find in polytechnic, tertiary education institutions, a university, for example. But I think beyond just stating the model and giving those examples, it's probably important to look into a few things. Like, for example, if you're looking at an average, at the average performance model or GPA model, are you going to have bell curves? Are you going to standardize the exam across all schools, or will there be bell curves within the school itself? Will there be some form of moderation of the results and all that? Because I think that can impact the assessment at the later stage and therefore affect certain questions in the debate, like whether or not the result coming from a certain result would have the same value if you come from a different school, for example. But I'll get into that later. So yeah, I think for a start, the model needs to be particularly clear in this debate because it can impact the way in which certain arguments are ran. Let's get into those arguments now, since I think it's easier to show how it impacts those arguments by explaining those arguments. There are a few things I think teams like to run in this debate and tend towards. Two key clashes that I identified that I think are likely to be red herrings. The first red herring that I think is likely to be present, or at least a clash that is likely to be under-impacted by teams, would be a clash on the quality of education. In other words, I think it's quite common for a lot of teams or debaters to try and run arguments that relate to whether or not a single examination is better because it prepares students for a high-stakes pressure situation, or whether a GPA system is better because it prepares students for consistent performance, right? The opposition can argue that a single high-stakes exam is useless or not as useful because there are rarely single high-stakes situations in the real world, and therefore consistency is more valued. The government can, side opposition, can push back by saying that there are many pressure situations in the real world and that students need to be prepped for that as well. But the reason why I think this overall clash tends to usually result in it becoming a red herring, or at least a wash, is because the problem with the outcome is that even if teams are able to prove their side of the coin better than the other, the most that I can get out of that is that you better prepare students for the real world. And the issue is that better preparing students for the real world often ends up very unimpactful for four reasons. The first is because for students who do end up going to university, there's another 4 years before they actually enter what you might consider the real world or working life, right? So it's not like your time in JC is going to define the way in which you are like when you enter the real world, or your time in polytechnic is going to affect the way which you look like in the real world. The second is because of the fact that there's also, for guys at least, like NS, right? So there's always going to be a time lapse between when you graduate and when you actually enter the workforce. But the third is also because of and I think this is the biggest reason why preparing students for the real world arguments don't work. The third reason is because of the fact that you can always learn a lot of these things when you actually start work. So things like being able to manage your workplace relations, being able to cope with the pressure of the workplace, being able to cope with the workload, these are things that aren't really replicated in school, regardless of the exam format, or regardless of the assessment format. So there are, the problem here is that I don't think that you can really, or teams can really prove that a change in the exam format or the assessment format is necessarily going to impart those skills that would get them ready for the workplace. I don't see why you can't learn those things in the workplace. But more importantly, the bigger issue also is that work life is often way too different from school life in the first place, and therefore, most of the time, at least from my experience, you learn how to cope with work through actually having work experience. This means to say that more often than not, when teams run arguments about preparing students for the real world, I usually think that those arguments don't quite get anywhere, or at least even if they do go somewhere, because they don't end up as a wash, they usually end up less important than the other arguments in the debate. I therefore think it's more strategic for teams to just not run these arguments at all. The second point the second clash I think also ends up usually as a red herring is a clash on stress. I think a lot of debaters have a tendency in a motion like this to steer towards arguments that a certain exam format would cause more stress for students. For example, OP can argue that the single high-stakes exam, because it's a one and only chance, it puts too much pressure on students. On the other hand, proposition teams, government teams might want to run that an argument that the consistent assessment is going to put a lot of stress on students, because that is something that because they're always being assessed, because every single test that they take will add on to their final GPA. The reason why I think this usually ends up a wash is because both sides can equally argue to large degrees that the exam format is going to cause stress. But the second reason why I also think it's usually a wash is because of the fact that the argument of stress can also be flipped between good and bad as well, right? Like, while teams can argue that a single high stakes exam would be very stressful, that's not necessarily a good or bad thing, right? The other side can always come back and flip the argument and say that it's good to have that form of stress, because that prepares students for stressful situations. That's the reason why I think arguments on stress are usually not going to get teams far, because they usually end up as either a wash in terms of the skill or the impact of stress on students. But more importantly, I think unless teams are able to show why one form of stress is stronger or is better or worse than the other, like the unique nature of the stress that arises from being constantly assessed vis-a-vis a single exam, I think it's usually hard to credit stress as a winning point or a winning clash, because it's not necessarily clear whether stress is a good or bad effect in the debate. The bigger problem I think that exists within this point is also that I think it's quite difficult for most debaters, or in general as a form of argumentation, to show why one form of stress is uniquely different and better than the other. Like, it is true perhaps that the nature of the stress that arises from a single exam can be kind of different from the nature of the stress that arises from the constant assessment. But the issue is that as much as they might seem kind of different, I think the impact that they have on students are often quite similar. And I think attempts at trying to differentiate them in terms of the way they affect students, or the way in which they affect any form of assessment or whatever, usually goes down to a lot of very nitpicky, more contrived reasons that aren't very clear on its surface, aren't very intuitive. So I don't think assessing stress is really going to get teams very far either. In terms of a clash though, I do think that the stress clash is one that, if credited, probably is slightly easier for a government proposition team, because of the fact that in the single high stakes model, there's probably more time for students to do what they want to do and mess around, because they can cram for their A-levels or their final examinations in the very last few months, right? Vis-a-vis the other model where they are constantly being assessed. So chances are, I think a proposition team would have a slight advantage here. But I think at the end of the day, stress is not a very big point that would get teams very far. Chances are it will only be relevant insofar as they can link it to the overall assessment that can be done at the end. Or basically, they can show how exactly stress would directly affect the way in which students perform at those examinations, and therefore affect their university admissions. I think that's when stress becomes relevant. In other words, stress has to be linked to the admission process and the admission results itself. Saying that students are more stressed or less stressed on its own likely won't get you anywhere. This brings me to the issues that I do think have more impact in the debate and are likely going to be more relevant. I think the first issue that would likely be kind of relevant, and this would likely be raised by the op side first, is an issue of accuracy. The opposition team would likely want to base some arguments on the some of the argumentation on the point that the overall average model or GPA system-ish is likely to be more accurate of an assessment because of the fact that it is more representative of a student's capabilities. Students can mess up when they are put in high pressure situations, and that single examination might not necessarily be representative of a student's capabilities. The government team can respond to this by saying that accuracy is I guess the first thing the government team can respond to this with is by having some form of mitigation measures, by basically saying that the single standardized examination is actually quite representative and quite accurate because it compiles everything that they studied for over the years. I think it's also possible for proposition teams to mitigate the high stress situation thing by talking about how schools tend to have a lot of intermediate exams over the years as well that would prepare students for that high pressure situation. So I think that's ways in which the government team can mitigate this point. For a government team to flip this point, I think there are perhaps two things they can do. The first thing they can do to flip the point is perhaps to argue that a GPA system is in fact inaccurate because, shit happens, right? In other words, students can have bad years or can have bad periods of time in their life. And insofar as those bad things happen to them, that would affect their overall GPA, and that shouldn't be representative of those students because of the fact that that isn't them at their best, or that isn't them at least their average, right? I think situations could be perhaps like, say, if students go through, like, say, I don't know, a breakup or something, they are stressed out because of their CCA competitions, or there are other things going on in their life. I think governments could show, state government or a proposition team can basically show that those particular instances can affect the overall assessment, and therefore a GPA system that assesses them at every point in time is not representative because it takes into account situations that students shouldn't be punished for, or students shouldn't be held accountable for with their grades. I think a possible odd response is to say that every student kind of goes through this at some point in time, or like students all have their ups and downs, and in life you need to manage those ups and downs. Therefore, it is quite an accurate capture. But I think a possible gov response to this would be to say that as much as that can be a very accurate capture, and I think this is the second way which the government team can flip the whole accuracy point. Gov could potentially argue that being way too accurate, being pinpoint accurate, is not a very useful metric because of the fact that, for one, it unfairly punishes students for situations out of their control, but at the same time, pinpoint accuracy on its own has no real value, right? At the end of the day, university admission standards or the point of university admission should be to try and empower students and enable them to be able to pursue further education, and get them to be qualified for that further education. So I think what government can say is that trying to be extremely accurate and to try and cull students because they're not able to deal with certain downs in their life is not fair to students at all, and it's not a useful way for us to assess students. Government team can also argue that accuracy is not useful insofar as it is accuracy left up to chance, because not all students go through breakups, not all students go through extreme low periods in their life, and insofar as you struck the lottery and didn't go through any of that but your friend did, that's not a very accurate assessment per se, even though it's technically accurate. I get it, this word accurate is becoming a little bit circular now, but basically pinpoint accuracy is sometimes not useful because at the end of the day you are basing accuracy of something that is left up to chance, and that is what happens in the daily life of a student. So I think that's one way in which government can flip the accuracy argument. But what government would then have to do is try and show why exactly the single high stakes examination is, although perhaps less accurate or less representative of the daily performance of a student, why exactly that is a fair metric and a good enough metric in status quo. I think this is where government can argue that a single standardized examination is better an assessment because it is better able to level the playing field between students. In other words, because it is a single examination, everyone knows the format, everyone knows what goes into the examination. For one, it's more representative because everyone is assessed in the exact same way. Vis-a-vis, if you're in a different school, maybe your assessment is slightly different, and therefore that affects the GPA system. But I think the other way in which the government team can also argue that it levels the playing field is to argue that for students who are less fortunate, who are of lower income backgrounds and whatnot, it's easier for them to prepare for a single standardized test because of the flexibility of time given to students when they are preparing for just a single exam. In other words, for one, it allows them to deal with whatever problems they might have, and they can still do well in the examination by cramming towards the end of their last year of pre-university education. But also the flexibility of time also helps them insofar as some of these students perhaps say need to work part-time, right? Because they don't have to be assessed constantly. They can still work part-time, and then they can just focus on the examination in the last few months of school, which is entirely doable. An opposition team might respond to the playing field argument by saying that a single test can be gamed, and that this in fact makes it harder for students to from less well-off backgrounds or who are not privileged to do well, because of the fact that privileged students can easily go for tuition lessons, for example, or seek external help because it's a standardized examination. It's easier to seek services like that. The opposition, a response to this that can come out from the government would likely be that tuition exists anyways on the opposition side as well. But I don't think just saying that tuition is not mutually exclusive is going to be winning for a government team, because the logic that would come up from the opposition team, or at least an opposition team that runs this argument well, would be that tuition services exist insofar as it's very easy to prepare students for a fixed curriculum or a very fixed exam that exists at the end of their academic journey. When the assessment becomes very when the assessment is one that's set, say, by a school, or is run solely within the framework of schools themselves. In other words, if you're in Hwa Chong, you're taking Hwa Chong's paper. If you're in Nanyang, you're taking Nanyang's paper, that sort of thing, right? It's harder for tuition services to provide those services, and therefore they don't exist as much. So I think the nature of tuition that would exist in the opposition world is going to be very different from the nature of tuition in the government world, and therefore a government team can't just respond to an opposition team by saying that tuition is not mutually exclusive. What they could do though is to argue that tuition would actually become more exclusive to privileged students in the opposition world, and that is because of the fact that insofar as there's less availability of, say, standardized tuition services, it is likely that the people who will get those private tutoring and will get those get help from tuition services are likely going to be only students who are a lot more privileged, because they can afford to pay for tutors who would fine-tune and base their lessons off your school's syllabus or your school's examination format and whatnot. That could perhaps make the assessment slightly more elitist in the opposition, and that's what a government team could try and push for with regards to this subclash on tuition. Another question that can perhaps arise in this debate also would be how exactly this affects, say, the uni selection process. I say the uni selection process because in certain courses, for example, or certain universities, sometimes a grade on its own is not sufficient, and you need to compare, say, your portfolio, or you need to take an interview, for example, right? Which are all very subjective forms of assessment that are stacked on top of your initial assessment based on your grades. Given that the motion only focuses on the examination standards, chances are these subjective forms of assessment would still exist, and I think it would be hard for a team to try and exclude these subjective forms of assessment from the debate. This is where I think the model comes in a bit, because in status quo, when it comes to, say, subjective assessment in universities like interviews or portfolio assessments, arguably or historically, coming from certain schools can give you a certain advantage due to, say, certain biases, right? The issue then would be whether or not a GPA system would worsen this vis-a-vis, say, a standardized like A-level system, because a government team could argue that a GPA system would make this subjective biases a bigger problem, because a higher average score in one school can be worth less or more than that same average score for coming from another school to the university, because the university might deem one school more competitive than the other. This is in comparison to a standardized exam where straight A's at the A levels would be equally valued across the board. The opposition could argue that the subjective biases exist regardless. In other words, it's not mutually exclusive. But I don't think that's sufficient as well, because similar to the previous point I was talking about, a government team can easily come in and say that while subjective biases exist in their world as well, it is a lot worse in the opposition's world. I think what the opposition could try to do to argue that to mitigate subjective biases would be to argue that there are strong efforts in Singapore to try and get rid of these subjective biases by pushing for things like every school is a good school. I'm not sure how far that would go, but that's one way in which the opposition team could try to mitigate the issue here. I think that's where the model comes in, because in order for opposition team to avoid this point from being being blown up, what they could perhaps do is to set quite clearly in their earlier model that the GPA system, or the assessment on their side basically, would still have a standardized syllabus, or still have a lot of standardization across schools, and I think that would help mitigate the biases that university administrators and all that could have when it comes to selecting students or subjectively assessing students, because insofar as the syllabus and the examination and all that is still quite standard across schools, that would allow or that will prevent them from being able to justify or remove certain underlying biases that they might have, right? The problem with this, however, and macking on the opposition side, I think, would be then feasibility, because it might seem intuitively a bit unfeasible to have every single school run the exact same examination across like all of their exams. I think it's also a bit unrealistic to require all schools to have the same number of examinations, exact same timing of examinations, everything. You can do that for one single A levels, but if you're talking about all of their CAs, SAs, or their midterm examinations, I think it's a bit hard. So opposition wants to be a bit careful with the way in which they preempt some of these things in their mechanization, their policy setting. But I think the baseline that the opposition should at least try to do is to show that there will be some level of standardization, at least across the syllabus and at least across the examination format. That could help with this point on biases in the selection process. Overall, I think a team that is able to win this debate will likely be a team that can firstly weigh out better between the different clashes. For example, I think winning accuracy on opposition on its own is probably not enough to win the debate, insofar as the government team can also show very strongly on their side that their exam is more equitable and is better able to level the playing field between students. But same goes for government. Leveling the playing field is probably not enough on its own if you don't win accuracy as well. And if you just pit these two clashes on face value against each other, I think what teams need to do in order to conclusively win would be to weigh out not just within clashes but between clashes as well, to show why certain aspects of an assessment of students is probably more important than other aspects. For example, why assessing them accurately is perhaps more important than being able to level the playing field. Or why perhaps subjective biases overpower, or how exactly it interacts with the accuracy of assessment, or it supersedes the accuracy of assessment insofar as an increase in subjective biases would mute the effect of accuracy, because being able to assess students very accurately won't go far insofar as biases are created in the process. That's something that's a form of weighing that perhaps a government team can input in this debate. Yeah. So yeah, I think although these are clear clashes, and I think these are ways in which you can run the argument, a lot of it comes down to weighing and comes down to responses. So do think about that when you come up with, and when you set your case and come up with your arguments, because you do need to show why the certain clash that you're trying to push for is perhaps the more important clash or the more important aspect of the assessment for students in light of their university admissions. Yeah, I know this was a bit messy, but I hope it helps. Thanks.